Medieval England was not sexually silent, no matter how many modern people try to gaslight the past into wearing a fake halo. The church preached restraint, the law tried to police desire, and ordinary people kept right on being human, which is to say messy, curious, and occasionally impossible to shame. If you think the Middle Ages were one long candlelit sermon about purity, congratulations, you have been sold a very expensive lie. By the time we reach York, the city is already a stage where theology, commerce, and appetite keep bumping shoulders in the street like drunk cousins at a wedding. York mattered because it was not some sleepy backwater where everyone politely stared at their shoes. It was one of the great English cities of the later Middle Ages, a place of trade, clergy, craftsmen, pilgrims, and all the social friction that comes when people live packed together behind walls and under rules they do not always obey. The city's streets carried sermons, market noise, animal dung, gossip, and temptation in equal measure. And if that sounds unholy, well, welcome to medieval urban life, where the soul was supposed to be saved while the body kept making trouble. The official Christian line on sex was never subtle. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, treated lust as a consequence of the fall, something tied to human disorder after Eden. He did not invent medieval sexual morality, but he helped shape its nervous system. Then Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, gave that morality a sharper blade. In the Summa Theologiae, he argued that sexual acts had to be ordered toward procreation within marriage, and that anything outside that order was sinful. That was the theory. Clean, severe, and very confident, like a man explaining fire safety while standing in a powder magazine. But theory and practice were never the same thing. Medieval people married, flirted, cheated, joked, bargained, and sinned with a consistency that would have exhausted a saint. The church could define fornication as a sin, but it could not erase desire from the human body. It could preach against lust, yet it still had to deal with the fact that people kept showing up with pregnancies, scandals, and confessions. The result was not silence. It was management. Moral rules, court records, penitentials, sermons, and public shame all worked together to keep desire visible, named, and judged. And here is where the story gets interesting. Because public pleasure was not some modern invention smuggled into the past by a time traveler with bad intentions. Medieval towns had festivals, processions, taverns, alehouses, and communal spaces where people gathered, watched, laughed, drank, and looked at one another with very human interest. Public life was crowded and performative. People were seen. People were judged. People were also, inconveniently, people. The line between sacred and profane was thinner than a monk's patience on a feast day. York's records and urban culture show a city where morality was constantly being negotiated in public. Clergy preached against vice, but the city itself was full of the ordinary conditions that made vice hard to avoid and impossible to ignore. Inns, markets, and streets created opportunities for contact. Festivals loosened tongues. Humor did the rest. Medieval people were not prudish automatons. They knew exactly what bodies were for, what bodies wanted, and what bodies could get them into. The joke was never that sex did not exist. The joke was that everyone pretended to be shocked when it did. That tension between doctrine and daily life is the real medieval story. Augustine and Aquinas gave the church its language of control, but York gave us the lived reality, a city where public order and private appetite kept colliding. The medieval world was not sexually silent. It was noisy, regulated, embarrassed, and deeply aware of its own hypocrisy. And if you think that sounds familiar, well, that is because modern people still love to preach one thing and do another. Different century, same human nonsense. But York's streets hide far dirtier truths. By the later Middle Ages, York had recognized places where prostitution clustered, especially around the city's busy commercial life, near inns, taverns, and the roads where strangers came and went. This was not a neon-lit district with a sign out front, obviously, but a social geography shaped by traffic, anonymity, and opportunity. Medieval towns were crowded, noisy, and full of men with wages in their pockets and bad judgment in their heads. The city authorities did not invent vice, but they did try to contain it, because the medieval answer to almost every human problem was to regulate it, shame it, tax it, or all three at once. The The church's official position was brutally clear. Sex outside marriage was sinful, and prostitution was treated as a moral stain on the community. Yet the same church that thundered against lust also depended on the idea that sinners could be corrected, managed, and folded back into order. That meant confession, penance, and public discipline. It also meant that clerics had to talk about sex constantly, which is one of history's funniest little ironies. The people most eager to denounce the flesh were often the ones who knew the most about it. Nothing says moral authority like a man in a robe explaining temptation with the confidence of someone who has never once been tempted by a decent meal, a warm bed, or a scandal. And then there were the clerical double standards, which were not exactly rare enough to qualify as news. Medieval churchmen preached chastity, but records across England show that clergy could be caught in sexual misconduct, concubinage, and other forms of behavior that made their sermons sound like a joke told by the wrong man. The gap between doctrine and practice was not a crack in the system. It was the system. The church condemned prostitution as sinful, yet it also tolerated the uncomfortable fact that prostitution existed because men kept demanding access to it. So the institution did what institutions do best. It gaslit the public with moral language while quietly adapting to reality. That reality left traces everywhere. One of the strangest is the surviving badge culture of medieval and early modern Europe, including erotic badges and tokens that could be worn, traded, or displayed as part of festive or sexual subcultures. These objects are not always easy to interpret because the past loves to leave us artifacts and then refuse to label them. But they remind us that medieval people used symbols, jokes, and wearable objects to signal identity and desire. The body was not just a body. It was a message board, and sometimes that message was filthy. Manuscripts add another layer of evidence, because medieval books were not always solemn little prayer machines. Marginalia, comic drawings, and obscene imagery appear in a range of manuscripts, proving that scribes and readers were perfectly capable of mixing devotion with dirty-minded amusement. The medieval page could hold saints, monsters, and sexual jokes in the same visual neighborhood. That is not a contradiction. That is medieval culture refusing to behave for the camera. If you have ever seen a modern comment section derail into chaos, congratulations, you already understand the basic energy. Then there is the medical side of the story, which is where the whole thing gets even more awkward. Medieval and early modern writers were deeply interested in impotence, fertility, and the mechanics of sex, because sex was not just a moral issue. It was a legal issue, a medical issue, and a social issue. A marriage that could not be consummated could become a legal problem. A man who could not perform could become the subject of scrutiny, humiliation, and, in some cases, formal testing. Yes, really. The so-called impotence tests, especially in later medieval and early modern contexts, could involve examinations by midwives or other women to determine whether a husband was physically capable of intercourse. Imagine being summoned to prove your manhood like a badly dressed contestant on the world's most humiliating reality show. Medieval society loved public judgment almost as much as it loved pretending it was above it. These tests mattered because marriage was not only about affection. It was about inheritance, legitimacy, property, and the production of heirs. If a marriage was disputed, the body itself could become evidence. That is the part modern people often miss. Medieval sexuality was never just private pleasure. It was tied to law, theology, and the future of a family line. The church wanted sex ordered toward procreation, but the courts wanted proof that procreation was possible, and the household wanted certainty that the whole arrangement would not collapse into embarrassment and litigation. The human body, once again, was expected to carry the weight of everyone else's expectations. No pressure. Kate Lister's work cuts through this mess with the kind of blunt clarity that medieval sources rarely offer on their own. She follows the evidence where it actually lives, in records, objects, and the stubborn residue of lived experience. York's sex work districts were not just places of sin in the abstract. They were part of a city economy that depended on movement, secrecy, and demand. The church could condemn the trade, but it could not erase the conditions that made it profitable. Men traveled, men drank, men lied, men paid. Then everybody acted shocked, like a Karen discovering that the bakery sells cake. And the deeper you go, the more the hypocrisy starts to stink. Clergy preached purity while navigating a world full of temptation, compromise, and institutional self-protection. Badges and manuscripts show that medieval people were not sexually blind. They were visually and verbally obsessed with the subject. Impotence tests reveal that sex could become a matter of public proof, not private feeling. York, in other words, was not a city of silence. It was a city of surveillance, rumor, and bodies under pressure. Then Eleanor Reichner turns the whole story personal. Then Eleanor Reichner steps out of the shadows and reminds us that medieval sex was never just a private hobby with bad lighting. It was politics with a pulse, gossip with a seal, and sometimes a weapon sharp enough to draw blood without ever leaving the bedroom. In the Tower of London, where kings locked up rivals and history kept its knives close, desire could become leverage, accusation, or a very expensive mistake. And if that sounds like a soap opera, well, congratulations, because the Middle Ages were basically a soap opera with more plague. Eleanor Reichner is not a household name, which is exactly why she matters here. She appears in the records of the Tower in the early 15th century, tied to the world of court and confinement, where women could be watched, judged, and used as pieces on a board they did not control. The Tower was not only a prison. It was a stage for royal power, a place where loyalty was tested, enemies were contained, and the private lives of the elite could become public business in a heartbeat. In that kind of environment, sex was never merely sex. It was reputation, inheritance, and survival, wearing a silk gown and pretending not to sweat. This is where the old fantasy of courtly love gets dragged into the alley and searched for cash. Courtly love, in the polished literary version, was all longing glances, noble suffering, and people acting like emotional starvation was a virtue. It was a performance, a code, a game of status. But medieval people also knew the other side of the coin, the side that did not smell like roses and poetry. They knew about lust, bargaining, pregnancy, adultery, and the practical consequences of bodies doing what bodies do. The same culture that could write elegant verses about devotion could also laugh at bawdy jokes, trade obscene stories, and treat sexual failure as fair game for ridicule. One moment you are a knight sighing over an unattainable lady, and the next you are the punchline in a joke about a husband who cannot perform. Medieval society contained both the sonnet and the smirk, and it did not see any contradiction at all. That is the part modern people keep trying to sand down. We like our ancestors either saintly or savage, pure or filthy, as if human beings ever came that neatly packaged. But medieval sources keep refusing to cooperate. They show a world where sex could be sacred, strategic, comic, shameful, and ordinary all at once. A marriage might be discussed in terms of alliance and property, then mocked in a fablio for its bodily absurdities. A noble woman might be expected to embody chastity in public, while everyone around her understood that desire was still moving under the table like a drunk rat. The joke was not that medieval people were secretly modern. The joke was that they were never as prudish as later generations wanted them to be. And that is why Eleanor Reichner matters in this story. Her presence in the Tower's orbit pulls us away from the fantasy that medieval sexuality lived only in sermons or only in brothels. It lived in households, prisons, courts, marriages, and rumors. It lived wherever power and flesh collided, which was basically everywhere. The Tower itself, with its stone walls and cold authority, becomes a perfect symbol for the whole mess. It was built to contain bodies, but it could not contain appetite, scandal, or the stories people told about both. Medieval politics loved control. Medieval people loved talking about what control could not quite manage. That tension is the whole game. So when we talk about courtly love versus smut, we are not talking about two separate worlds. We are talking about two languages for the same human chaos. One language wore perfume and quoted poetry. The other laughed in the kitchen, in the tavern, and in the margins of manuscripts. Both were medieval. Both were real. Both understood that sex was never just about pleasure. It was about power, status, fertility, shame, and the endless comedy of people pretending they were above their own bodies. That is why the sources are so valuable, and why they are so funny. They do not flatter us. They do not flatter the past either. They simply tell the truth, and the truth is usually less polished and far more entertaining than modern respectability wants to admit. And that leaves us with the lasting lesson. Medieval people were frank about sex because they had to be. They lived in a world where marriage could be contested, heirs could be disputed, bodies could be inspected, and reputation could be ruined by a rumor with good timing. They were funny about sex because humor was one of the few tools available when life was this intrusive and this fragile. They were practical about sex because practical people survive longer than hypocrites. They knew the difference between idealized love and bodily reality, and they were not embarrassed to laugh at the gap. If anything, they built a whole culture around it. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were sexually silent, picture Eleanor Reichner in The Tower's Hard Shadow. Picture the courtly lover with his hand on his heart and his dignity in pieces. Picture the bawdy joke slipping under the door while the sermon is still echoing in the hall. Medieval England was not shy. It was not delicate. It was not waiting for modern people to invent candor. It was already there, grinning through the grime, and the joke, as ever, was on modern prudishness.